In 1890, Seraphina Blackwood bought a town to hide her terrible sexual crimes. She owned every business, every house, and every person in Blackwood Bluff. She used that power to hunt down the men who lived there, 61 men and 61 victims. She called them to her manor for what she called private consultations. What happened in those porcelain rooms was beyond words. Some never came back. Others came back as empty shells who drank themselves to death. And when she got pregnant from these attacks, the babies just went away. The doctor in town tried to expose her. He found the hidden ledger and collected the proof. He had proof of every name, crime, and cover-up. But Seraphina had the sheriff, the mayor, and their fear. How does a monster dressed in silk and pearls kill 61 people and get everyone in town to keep quiet about it? Dr. Alistair Finch pressed his face against the window of the carriage and watched as the town came to life like a painting. The wheels of the carriage clattered against the cobblestones of Blackwood Bluff. The mountain valley was painted in shades of amber and crimson by October. The cool autumn air smelled like wood smoke and success. After living in the filthy, disease-ridden tenements of the city for 3 years, where death was always around and hope faded like flowers in the winter, this place seemed almost too clean. The streets were clean, the windows shone, and every building had a new coat of paint that showed it had been cared for and cost a lot of money. The horses looked well fed too. In the middle of town, there was a bronze statue of a woman in flowing robes, with her hand outstretched as if to bless everyone who came by. Seraphina Blackwood, founder and benefactor 1875, was all that was written on the stone. Alistair looked at the carved face, which was beautiful and peaceful, with eyes that seemed to follow him as the carriage rolled by. Around the statue, merchants sold their goods from stalls that were full of them, kids played in clean clothes, and men tipped their hats to say hello. It was everything the recruiting letter said it would be, and more. A place where a doctor could work without seeing mothers bury their babies, or fathers drink themselves to death over debts they could never pay. That night, the town meeting took place in the new community hall, which was decorated with pictures of the same woman whose statue stood in the square. Alistair had just finished introducing himself to the crowd when she came in, moving through the room like silk over water. Seraphina Blackwood was probably in her 40s, but she moved with the timeless grace of someone who had never known want. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken hours to perfect, and her dress was the deep blue of midnight sky, cut from fabric that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. But her eyes were what really caught people's attention. They were smart, warm, and focused with an intensity that made everyone she talked to feel like they were the most important person in the world. "Dr. Finch," she said, holding out her hand and smiling so brightly that it made her already beautiful face look even more beautiful. "How wonderful that you've chosen to join our little community. We've been without proper medical care for far too long." Her voice had the refined accent of someone who had gone to school in the East, but there was real warmth in it, not the cold condescension he had expected from someone with her obvious wealth and position. She spoke with a lot of passion about her duties to the people of Blackwood Bluff and how she saw each resident as part of a large family that she had to protect and care for. The clinic she offered him had all the newest medical tools, and the salary she offered was more than enough to pay off his medical school debts and still live well. Alistair saw the faces of the men in the crowd as she spoke. They looked at her with more than just respect and thanks. Their eyes showed a kind of religious awe, along with something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Afraid? No, that word seemed too strong. Maybe it was just the natural respect that people had for the person who gave them their jobs. "This town exists because of her," said the man next to him, in a low voice. He was a blacksmith, and his rough hands showed that he worked hard. "Before Miss Seraphina came, we were barely surviving. Now look around. Prosperity, safety, hope. She's given us everything." The man's voice was still full of respect, but when Alistair looked at him more closely, he saw that the blacksmith's eyes never quite met Seraphina's directly, and that he seemed to shrink a little bit every time she looked at him. At the end of the night, Seraphina gave Alistair the keys to both the clinic and a nice house on Elm Street. She also gave him a formal welcome that got everyone to clap. Alcester felt a rush of hope that he hadn't felt in years as the crowd began to leave. Here was a place where he could really make a difference, where his skills would be valued and his hard work would be rewarded. The problems and failures of the city seemed like far-off nightmares compared to the promise of this mountain hideaway. 3 weeks later, on a night when the chill of October had turned into something that hinted at winter's approach, that promise broke like glass against stone. When someone knocked on Alcester's door loudly, it broke the quiet of the night. 2 men stood at his door, holding a third person who was limp and broken between them. "Doctor, please," one of them gasped. "It's Thomas Hartwell. He got hurt badly in a fight." Thomas was probably in his 20s and had the broad shoulders and strong arms of someone who worked with his hands. But when they brought him into the clinic and put him on the exam table, Alcester knew right away that this was not a normal bar fight. The young man's face was covered in fresh, dark bruises, but it was the older ones that made Alcester's blood run cold. Under the new wounds were scars that were there on purpose, showing that the pain was not caused by anger, but by careful, planned actions. Some had been around for months, while others had been around for years. They made patterns on Thomas's arms and torso that looked like systematic torture instead of random violence. "What happened?" Alcester asked. As he cleaned wounds and looked at the damage, the men who had brought Thomas looked at each other and exchanged glances. He could see that they were feeling the same mix of fear and respect that he had seen at the town meeting. "Drunk," one of them said under their breath. "Had a fight with some guys at the bar. You know how young men are. Too much pride and too much drink." But Thomas's wounds told a different story. These weren't the messy, chaotic wounds that happen in a drunken fight. They were carefully placed, almost like surgery, to cause the most pain without hurting any important organs permanently. And the young man's mental state might have been even worse than his physical state. His eyes moved around the room like a trapped animal trying to get out, and he flinched at every touch, even Alcester's gentle medical exam. As the night went on and the sedative Alcester had given Thomas started to work, his stiff fear slowly turned into delirious mumbling. It was mostly jumbled words and half-finished pleas. But then, just as Alcester was finishing up with the last of his wounds, the young man's eyes opened wide with horrible clarity. "The porcelain room," Thomas whispered, his voice so low that it was hard to hear, but it was full of such fear that it seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. He clawed at Alcester's sleeve with all the strength he could muster. She makes you watch yourself break in the mirrors." "All those mirrors." His voice broke, and tears started to flow down his bruised face. "The babies! God, forgive me! The babies!" Then his eyes rolled back and he passed out, leaving Alcester alone in the clinic with thoughts that felt dangerous even to think. The wind outside had picked up, shaking the windows like skeletal fingers trying to get in. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang slowly and steadily, marking not only the passing of time, but also the end of innocence itself. Thomas was out cold for 2 days. When he finally woke up, the fear in his eyes had turned into something worse. A blank, empty stare that seemed to look right through Alcester as if he were made of glass. The young man only said one word or nothing at all when asked questions. He flinched away from any attempts to comfort or reassure him. When Alcester asked about his injuries, Thomas just shook his head and said, "Fell down drunk. My own fault." But his hands shook as he spoke, and he kept looking out the window, as if he expected someone to show up there at any moment. It was then that Alcester began to see what had been right in front of him the whole time. As he went around Blackwood Bluff over the next few weeks, he began to notice patterns that scared him more than the coming winter. There were way too many men in this wealthy town who showed clear signs of having been through a lot of trauma that had lasted a long time. People came to his clinic saying they couldn't sleep, had stomach problems, and were feeling what the townspeople politely called melancholy. But their symptoms were a lot worse than just being depressed or overworked. Marcus Whelan, the baker, had such bad shaking in his hands that he could barely knead dough. However, when Alcester suggested looking at him more closely, he said nothing was wrong. Samuel Cross, who worked in the grain mill, had taken to drinking so heavily that his wife feared for his life. But when Alice Tister tried to discuss treatment, Samuel's face went white, and he stammered excuses before fleeing the clinic entirely. The most disturbing thing was how these men acted when they heard Seraphina Blackwood's name or her manner. Their faces would lose color, their breathing would become quick and shallow, and they would come up with urgent reasons to end the conversation and leave right away. The manor stood over the town like a watchful guardian or a patient predator. Its white columns and perfectly kept gardens could be seen from almost every street corner. While walking every day, Alice Tister noticed how the men of the town seemed to change their routes without thinking about it to avoid getting too close to its iron gates. He noticed that women did not feel the same way. They walked past without concern, sometimes even pausing to admire the elaborate flower arrangements that lined the entrance. Only the men seemed to feel its invisible pull of fear. Alice Tister, who was desperate for answers and more sure that Thomas's cryptic words held the key to understanding the town's strange undercurrents, went to see Elias Croft, an old man who kept the town's records in a small office above the general store. Croft was a thin, jittery man with ink-stained fingers and skin that looked like it had been hunched over ledger books all day. On a gray November afternoon, Alice Tister knocked on the man's office door, and his reaction was quick and telling, "No," Croft said before Alice Tister could even say anything. His voice was sharp with fear. "No matter what you're here for, the answer is no. I only keep records, birth and death certificates, property transfers, and other normal business. Nothing that would interest a doctor." But Alice Tister had read enough faces to know the difference between real confusion and desperate deflection. "I'm not here to talk about medical issues," he said carefully as he stepped into the messy office, even though Croft clearly didn't want him to. "I'm trying to figure out some patterns I've seen in the men in this town and how they are having trouble." These words had an immediate and terrible effect on Croft. The older man's hands shook so much that he knocked over an inkwell, spilling black liquid all over the papers on his desk. He whispered, "You need to leave." But his eyes said something else. They had the same haunted look that Alice Tister had seen on Thomas's face, the look of someone who had seen terrible things and had to deal with them alone. "Please," Alice Tister said, his voice soft but firm. "I think you know what I'm talking about. Thomas Hartwell came to me almost dead, and he's not the only one who's hurting. I'm a doctor, and I swore to help people, but I can't help if I don't know what's going on." For a long time, Croft looked at him with the same intensity as a man weighing his life against his conscience. Finally, he walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the office and took out a second set of record books. These were thinner than the official volumes and were bound in plain brown leather instead of the fancy covers used for public documents. "Municipal records," Croft said in a voice that was barely audible. "Births, deaths, and departures. But take a closer look at the dates. Look at the patterns." His hands shook as he opened the first book. 23 orphaned babies in the last 10 years. Each one was listed as mother unknown or mother died in childbirth. Each one was quietly sent to an institution in a faraway city within weeks of birth. "And look here," he said, flipping to another page and tracing his finger down columns of dates. The timing. Samuel Morrison left town suddenly in June of '88, 3 days before an orphaned baby was found. Daniel Pierce died in a hunting accident that same month. 2 days later, Marcus Whelan tried to kill himself the next week, but lived, though he's never been the same since. As Croft turned page after page, the pattern became horrifyingly clear. Young men were called to the manor for what the records called private meetings with Miss Blackwood about job opportunities. Some of them would leave town right away, sometimes in the middle of the night. Some people would die in accidents that were easy to avoid, like falling off a roof while hunting or drowning in the river when the weather was calm. Some, like Thomas, Marcus, and Samuel, would stay but be shadows of their former selves. They would become broken men who turned to alcohol, sadness, or just stopped living altogether. Alice Tister asked, "How long have you known?" even though he was afraid of the answer. 15 years, Croft said, and the weight of those words seemed to crush him. "I've been watching, recording, and not saying anything for 15 years. What could I say? Who would believe me? And even if they did, who would dare act against someone who owns every business, every job, and every hope of survival in this place? A soft knock at the office door came before Allister could answer. The two men froze, and in that moment of silence, they could hear the sound of expensive silk moving and soft footsteps on wooden stairs. Croft's face turned pale as he quickly closed the record books and put them back where they belonged. But it was too late. Without waiting for permission, the door opened, and Seraphina Blackwood walked in like winter entering a warm house. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice still warm, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop a little bit. "How lucky to find you here. I was hoping we could talk, just the two of us. Would you like to come to the manor for dinner tonight? I'm interested in what you think of our little community." Her smile was perfect, even radiant, but there was something in her eyes that made Allister's blood run cold. There was a predator behind that pretty face and polite manner who had just realized that her territory was in danger. The nice invitation was as warm and merciful as a death sentence written in beautiful calligraphy. The invitation to dinner hung between them like a knife held up by a silk thread. Allister politely turned him down, saying he had to take care of an urgent patient. But Seraphina's smile never wavered as she accepted his excuse with the gracious understanding of someone who had all the time in the world to wait for a better time. Croft sat in his chair like a man who had just seen his own execution scheduled after she left. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like someone who was already dead. He whispered, "You killed us both. She knows we've talked. She always does." But instead of backing down, the meeting made something cold and determined in Allister's chest. He made a choice that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks before that night, when he was lying awake in his house on Elm Street. If Seraphina Blackwood owned the law, the government, and the money that kept Blackwood Bluff alive, he would have to fight her with the only weapon she couldn't buy or scare: the truth, which he had collected piece by painful piece from the men she had broken. He started his investigation by pretending to be a doctor, making house calls. Over the following weeks, Allister systematically visited every household in town, offering to check on the health and well-being of the residents during the harsh winter months. He told anyone who asked that it was charitable work, a way to give back to the community that had welcomed him so warmly. Most families welcomed him with open arms because they were thankful for the doctor's care that they couldn't afford otherwise. But when he talked to the men of these families in private, he hit a wall of silence that felt like it had weight. Richard Moss, the carpenter, started to stutter whenever Allister brought up the manor or Miss Blackwood's job interviews. James Fletcher, who ran the town's small printing press, would suddenly remember important work whenever these subjects came up. He would leave his own home to avoid talking about them. Even men who showed obvious signs of trauma, trembling hands, startled responses to unexpected sounds, the hollow eyes of those who had seen too much, would insist with desperate conviction that nothing was wrong, that their problems were their own fault, the result of drink or laziness or moral weakness. In December, during one of the worst snowstorms anyone could remember, things finally changed. Allister was on his way home from a hard berth when he saw a light flickering in the window of a rundown cabin on the outskirts of town. He found William Pike inside. He used to work in the stables at Blackwood Manor, but now he lived in filthy isolation, getting by on odd jobs and the kindness of neighbors who felt sorry for him as he clearly fell into alcoholism. Pike was very drunk when Allister knocked, but not so drunk that he couldn't see the doctor's face in the light of the lamp. Pike slurred, "You came to check on the town drunk?" But there was something in his eyes that made it seem like he was thankful for being around other people, even doctors. "There's nothing wrong with me that a bottle can't fix, or make worse, depending on how you look at it." Allister sat with the man for an hour, sharing warmth by his small fire, and letting Pike talk about things that didn't matter, like the weather, how hard it was to find work, and how lonely winter nights were. The real story didn't come out until the man's guard was completely down, when the alcohol and tiredness had taken away his carefully built defenses. "She calls it consultation," Pike said in a whisper, staring into the flames with the blank look of someone who is reliving a nightmare. "It sounds like business, but there's nothing professional about what happens in that porcelain room. All those mirrors. She makes you watch yourself while while she takes what she wants. Takes everything. Your dignity, your strength, your very soul. His voice broke, and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. I was 18 when she first called me. I was strong and proud and thought I could handle anything. She broke me like I was made of glass. Allister had a hard time not throwing up after the confession that came next. Pike talked about ritualized abuse that lasted for months, and psychological torture meant to take away every bit of his masculine identity and self-worth. He talked about other men who had gone through the same thing. Some had been able to leave the town. Others had chosen death over living. And still others had stayed, but were forever changed. Pike said, "Thomas Hartwell," in a voice that was hard to hear. "He's the newest one. This has been going on for almost 2 years now. Poor kid. He thought he could resist at first, and tried to fight back. That's when she really gets creative with the punishment." He looked up at Allister with eyes that knew too much. "Do you want names, Doctor? I can give you names. 61 men in the last 15 years. Some are dead, some are missing, and some are still walking around this town like ghosts. We all have her mark." With Pike's terrible testimony and the list of names he gave him, Allister went back to Elias Croft with a new sense of purpose. This time, the records keeper gave in right away. His defenses had worn down like water on stone because he felt guilty about not talking to her for 15 years and was becoming more and more sure that Serafina knew about their last conversation. Croft said, "I've been keeping a second ledger," and his hands shook as he got a thin book bound in black leather. Not official records, just paperwork. Evidence, I guess, but I never thought anyone would be brave or stupid enough to use it. Croft's careful handwriting filled the book with detailed entries, dates, names, and short notes that told the story of nearly 2 decades of systematic horror. Each entry meant that another young man had to come to the manor, which made Serafina happy because it ruined another life. But the last part of the ledger showed just how bad she was. Croft had written down something else, a pattern of births that happened at the same time as the most broken of her victims, the pregnancies. He said in a low voice, full of self-hatred. She never really tried to hide them. She would go away for months at a time, saying she was traveling for her health. But I knew. Everyone knew. She hired Molly Bracken, an old midwife who had been kicked out of the city for drinking. Molly would deliver the babies in secret, and within days, they'd be gone, sent to orphanages or foundling homes, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Serafina kept records of it all, like she was proud of it, like it was just another business deal. Allister asked, "How many?" Even though he didn't want to know. Croft said 12. Over the years, she had 12 babies, all boys, every single one of them. It was like she was trying to make an army of sons she wouldn't have to deal with. He closed the ledger with shaking hands. Molly died 3 years ago. Some might say it was a good time for her to die. She drank herself to death, but not before she told me about the porcelain room where the births happened. She said it was the most beautiful and most evil place she'd ever seen. That night, as Allister walked home through the snowy streets with the black ledger hidden under his coat, he felt the weight of 61 broken lives pressing against his chest like a stone. The pattern was clear, and the evidence was damning. But even though he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks, a cold wind seemed to whisper a warning that justice and evidence were not the same thing, and that Serafina Blackwood could buy truth in Blackwood Bluff. Serafina's revenge was as precise as a surgeon's and as brutal as an executioner's. 3 days after Allister talked to Elias Croft, William Pike's body was found in his filthy cabin, slumped over his rough wooden table with an empty bottle of laudanum next to his cold hand. Sheriff Marcus Thornton, a big man with a lot of money in his expensive boots and gold watch chain, said it was suicide before the body was even cold. Thornton told the few neighbors who had gathered outside the cabin that Pike had been sad about his drinking. He killed himself instead of living on the charity of the community. But Allister knew better. When he looked at Pike's body, he said he had the right as the town's only doctor to confirm the cause of death. He found bruises around the mouth and throat, defensive wounds on the hands that had been carefully placed after death, and, most damning of all, the man's fingernails which had skin on them that clearly didn't belong to him. Pike fought back against his killers until the end. The official record would only show a troubled man who had decided to end his pain by taking too much of the painkiller he had been given for chronic back pain. Sheriff Thornton said, "Tragic business," as they took Pike's body away, but his eyes showed no sympathy, only the cold calculation of a man doing necessary but unpleasant work. These broken men never seem to find peace in this world. Of course, some folks might say it's a mercy when their suffering finally ends. The words were clearly meant as a warning, and Allister understood their meaning perfectly. Keep digging, and you'll join Pike in whatever shallow grave they've prepared for inconvenient corpses. The second blow happened just a week later, when Thornton showed up at Allister's clinic with an official warrant and a serious look on his face that didn't quite hide how happy he was. "Dr. Finch," he said loudly enough for the people in the waiting room to hear, "you're under arrest for fraud, medical malpractice, and extortion of the people of Blackwood Bluff." The charges were ridiculous. He was accused of selling fake treatments, charging too much for services, and threatening to deny medical care unless patients paid outrageous fees. But they came with sworn statements from 3 different families, all written in the careful handwriting of people who had been told exactly what to say. "These are lies," Allister said as Thornton snapped iron manacles around his wrists. But the sheriff just shrugged and acted sorry. "Doctor, the court will take care of that. In the meantime, you'll be spending some time in our jail while we look into these serious claims about your character and professional behavior." The jail was a dark, damp cell in the basement of the courthouse that smelled like human waste. Allister was kept there for 3 days with only bread and water. During that time, Thornton and his deputies told everyone in town that their trusted doctor was a thief and a fraud. When they finally let him go, saying there wasn't enough evidence to file formal charges, though his reputation was already ruined, Allister found that his clinic had been vandalized, and his house had been marked with crude symbols that warned of the community's judgment. People who used to thank him now crossed the street to avoid looking him in the eye, and store owners suddenly found reasons to close their doors whenever he came near. At that point, Serafina dealt her last, most powerful blow. On a gray February morning, when the snow was thick on the ground and the wind promised more winter, she called for a special town meeting to talk about the unfortunate situation surrounding their former physician. The whole town of Blackwood Bluff packed into the community hall, filling every seat and lining the walls with people who were excited to see a public execution. Serafina stood at the podium in mourning black, her lovely face showing deep sadness and maternal worry. "My dear friends," she said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, "it breaks my heart to stand before you today to talk about the betrayal we have all suffered at the hands of someone we trusted, someone we welcomed into our community with open arms and generous hearts." Her performance was flawless, each word carefully chosen to paint Allister as a predator who had abused their hospitality and kindness. She talked about how he had used their isolation to his advantage, knowing that they had no other medical options and had to give in to his increasingly unreasonable demands. She talked about going to homes where he had supposedly threatened to let family members die if they didn't pay him a lot of money. This made him seem like a man who used other people's pain to get what he wanted. Most damning of all, she said that his recent questions about the people in town were part of a complicated blackmail scheme to get embarrassing secrets that he could use to get money from families that were already in a bad situation. "I blame myself," she said, wiping her eyes with a soft handkerchief. "I should have seen the signs sooner. I was so grateful that our community had medical care, that I didn't look into Dr. Finch's background and character properly. I found out later that he left his last job under suspicious circumstances, running away from debts and accusations that would have ruined his career if they had been pursued. Every word was a carefully planned poison that turned the community's fear and need into righteous anger that could be safely directed at a convenient scapegoat. The crowd's reaction was exactly what she had hoped for. Men who had once tipped their hats in greeting were now shouting accusations at each other, trying to show their loyalty and anger. Women whose kids Allister had treated for fever and injuries now said he had acted inappropriately during the exams, adding sexual misconduct to the list of crimes he was accused of. When Seraphina called for calm, the mob was ready to pull him out of hiding and hang him from the nearest tree. But the most tragic part of the night was when Elias Croft tried to be a hero. The records keeper, maybe out of guilt or a last burst of conscience, stood up in the back of the room and tried to speak truth to the fake anger. He yelled over the noise of the crowd, "This is all lies, and I can prove it. I have real records that show what she's really been doing to the men of this town." He waved the black ledger like a battle flag, and his voice broke with desperation. "I kept track of every one of the 61 victims over the course of 15 years. The silence that followed was deafening, except for Seraphina's soft, disappointed sigh. "Poor Elias," she said, sounding like a mother who felt sorry for him. "The stress of keeping our city records has clearly become too much for him. Maybe it's time we thought about finding him a comfortable retirement and a younger successor." The crowd murmured agreement, and Croft seemed to shrink before their eyes, realizing that his moment of bravery had only sealed his fate more completely. That night, Croft tried to leave town with his proof, but his carriage went off the mountain road in what would be called a tragic accident. The next morning they found his body, thrown far away from the wreckage, along with the burned remains of everything he had tried to save. Alcester, watching from the woods where he had been hiding since the town meeting, saw the smoke rising from the crash site and knew that his last hope for justice had died with the old man who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power, only to discover that power had no interest in listening. For 3 days after Elias Croft died, Alcester hid in an empty barn on the other side of the mountain. He ate frozen turnips he had stolen from a root cellar and melted snow in a rusty bucket. The cold got into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had formed around his heart as he watched the smoke rise from the crash site where the last evidence of Seraphina's crimes had been burned to ash. Every breath felt like a betrayal of the men whose stories would die with him, and every moment of living on was a slap in the face to Pike and Croft, who had paid the ultimate price for speaking the truth in a town built on lies. On the 4th night, as the wind howled through the cracks in the barn walls and his body shook with fever and despair, something deep inside him changed. The anger that had kept him going for weeks started to fade, and in its place came a clarity so strong that it cut through his sadness like a knife through silk. He couldn't win a public battle with Seraphina Blackwood. He couldn't bring the law from outside to a place where she owned every judge, every official, and every way to get justice. But as he sat there in the dark with the ghosts of 61 broken men, he realized that the fight had never been about courts, legal proceedings, or public vindication. It was about remembering the victims and making sure that their pain didn't fade away into the silence that Seraphina had bought with blood and gold. He now understood that justice wasn't always about punishment or the law. Sometimes, justice was just the promise that the truth would last longer than the lies that tried to hide it. Alcester stopped thinking about how to get away from Blackwood Bluff and started thinking about something much more dangerous and important. He had to write down everything he had learned, including every name, every detail, and every horrible confession. But he needed a safe place to do it, one that Seraphina's agents wouldn't think to check. He remembered Martha Henley, an old widow who lived in a rundown cottage on the edge of town, so far from the center of Seraphina's power that the community had almost forgotten about her. Her husband had been one of the most respected citizens in the community. 5 years ago, Martha's husband, who had been the town's blacksmith, died. Alcester remembered that Martha had always seemed a little different from the other women in Blackwood Bluff. She never joined in their praise of Seraphina's generosity or went to the town gatherings where their benefactor was honored. When Alcester showed up at her door around midnight, shaking and begging, she let him in without asking any questions. "I thought someone would come eventually," she said as she led him to her kitchen and started heating water for tea. "Someone who could see through her pretty mask and find the rotting skull underneath. My husband used to shoe her horses, you know." Sometimes the stable boys would come to him afterward, all torn up and broken, begging him to help them disappear. He tried when he could. Got 3 of them away to distant relatives before she caught on and stopped sending work to our smithy. Her eyes, faded with age, but still sharp with intelligence, studied Alcester with the frank assessment of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by human evil. "Doctor, "What do you want from me?" Allister started to write in Martha's cellar, where tallow candles lit the room and cast moving shadows on the stone walls. He didn't have any paper, except for what Martha could give him. Pages ripped out of old almanacs, the backs of letters, and even brown paper that had once wrapped things from the general store. But he wrote with the desperate care of a man making a will. He remembered Elias Croft's ledger and wrote it down again, but he didn't just write down names and dates. He wrote down everything he had learned, every secret confession and terrifying revelation. He wrote about Thomas Hartwell's broken whispers about the porcelain room and its mirrors, which made victims watch themselves die. He recorded William Pike's horrifying story of ritualized abuse meant to take away a man's sense of identity and worth. He wrote down the pattern of deaths that were convenient and sudden departures that had gotten rid of witnesses before they could talk. He wrote about the babies, which was the most important thing. There were 12 boys who were born in secret and sent to faraway orphanages. This was the ultimate example of Serafina's narcissistic power over the men she had destroyed. He wrote about the stories of 61 victims night after night, turning his cramped handwriting into a monument to their suffering. The work turned into more than just a record. It became a way to connect with the dead and broken, and carry their pain into a future where it might finally be recognized. He would stretch his fingers and keep writing when his hand got sore from writing. Martha would bring him new candles when the old ones burned out. He would keep writing even when he felt like giving up. He would think of Pike's bravery in speaking the truth, and Croft's last act of defiance. He spent 2 weeks writing what he called the Blackwood Bluff testimony. It was a document that not only listed the facts of Serafina's crimes, but also the human cost of her evil, written in the blood and tears of every man who had suffered in her porcelain hell. The stack of papers was almost 3 inches thick when it was done. It was tied together with twine and wrapped in oilcloth to keep it safe from the weather. Allister felt the weight of 61 souls in his hands, but he also felt something else, the strange lightness that comes when a heavy burden has finally been shared. Jacob Morris, a grizzled man who made his living carrying goods between remote mountain communities and the bigger cities to the east, was the traveling merchant who would take his testimony away from Blackwood Bluff. Allister had been watching him for days, paying attention to how he ran his business with fair prices and fair treatment, how he treated his horses with kindness, and how he spoke to even the poorest customers with respect. When Allister finally asked Morris to take a sealed package to a journalist in a city 200 miles away, Morris looked at his face very carefully, as if he had learned to quickly and accurately judge people's character. Morris finally said, "This package is going to cause trouble for someone, isn't it? Someone with enough power to make that trouble dangerous for both of us." Allister nodded, and Morris was quiet for a long time before reaching out his weathered hand. "Doctor, my father taught me that some things are more important than safety. Some truths are worth the risk of carrying them." As Allister watched Morris's wagon turn a corner on the mountain road and disappear, taking the Blackwood Bluff testimony toward whatever uncertain future awaited it, he felt a deep sense of peace for the first time in months. He might never see the paper in print. These mountains are so harsh that he might not make it another week as a fugitive. Serafina Blackwood would still be in charge of her rich town, which was safe because of fear and money, and the fact that people who were too broken or too dependent to speak out against her were too afraid to do so. But she didn't own the truth anymore. The voices of 61 victims traveled toward the light in that wagon, wrapped in oilcloth and twine. They brought with them proof that their suffering had not been in vain and that their pain had not been forgotten. Allister stood on a ridge that looked down on Blackwood Bluff. He saw the smoke rising from its busy chimneys and the light from its clean windows flickering. He realized that this was what justice sometimes looked like. Not winning in court or getting public support, not punishing the guilty, but protecting the truth, not saving the living, but honoring the dead. The search for truth had cost a lot, and its weight was both a burden and a blessing. With that payment, something like peace had finally been reached.